Hey Beam Tribe, it's Clayton from Pittsburgh, and I'm going to go over the importance of mobility training and why it's important. So, a lot of people have a lot of different definitions for what mobility training is. So we're going to try and simplify it and show you the reasons why you should prioritize it. So really the foundation of the mobility practice is CARS. So CARS is an acronym that stands for Controlled Articular Rotations. It's a long and fancy way of saying joint circles. So what you're going to be doing is learning how to take each one of your joints, head, shoulders, knees, and toes, and everything in between through its full range of motion. So you might ask, like, what's the importance of doing that? So we're basically trying to improve your hardware, and where we're trying to prioritize to improve where motion happens. So where the capsule meets the joint and the motion that happens closest to that space. So a lot of times people get hung up on, should I stretch this, or should I release that, or should I strengthen this? Mobility training really simplifies things in a lot of ways because you can really just focus on how well does my hip move, how well does my knee move, how well does my ankle move, and every joint through. So with CARS, basically you're taking each joint through its full range of motion and trying to work on improving where that motion happens, okay? So what you're gonna try and do is try and engage all the tissue around that joint space, okay? So if we're focusing on the hip, okay? If you're going through your hip range of motion, you want everything here on the outside, glutes, hamstring, everything to try and get on board as you take yourself through your full range of motion, okay? So tissue and different parts of the body are all really just variations in terms of densities of tissue and variations of like how solid or how supple is that tissue. So, you know, bone, tendon, ligament, joint capsule space, fascia, all this stuff is really just stuff, right? And it's just varying degrees of like how dense or how supple is that stuff. So it all responds to force. So there's this famous quote by Dr. Andrew Espina, and he says, "Force is the language of cells." So basically what that means is if you want to improve the functionality and capacity of that space, whether you're talking about capsule, muscle, tissue, whatever, you need to be able to apply a force to that space so that you can kind of tell that tissue how you want it to like lay down. So if you think about like an injury, right? If you get an injury, then that tissue is kind of disrupted. And then if you do nothing, like if you do no rehab or anything, you're basically not telling or not instructing how you want that tissue to be laid down, all right? You're not sending a signal or communicating a message. So that tissue will be very aberrant and kind of like scar tissue, right? So with mobility training, it's very highly specified strength training to very specific areas in the body, okay? So really, mobility training is just strength training. It applies to the same principles. You're just strength training very specific parts of the body and then trying to improve motion where it happens, okay? So it's just really important because with joint capsule space and really any part of the body, it responds to the principle of if you don't use it, you lose it, okay? So very simple. You want to be able to get into every little nook and cranny and make sure you have internal rotation, external rotation, extension, flexion through every part of your joint so you can maintain that joint health. Okay, so you're really shaped by your environment, and if you never really take the time to communicate with all those little different surface areas within the joint capsule, then it's not going to get the nourishment that it needs and be able to function properly. So when you take your joints to their full range of motion, it's essentially like brushing your teeth for your joints, right? Imagine if you didn't ever brush your back molars. You would probably have really, really bad breath and you would have cavities and issues and probably have to get a root canal. Same thing with your joints. If you never take your hip into internal rotation, your body's like, I guess you don't really need internal rotation of that hip space. So then over time, you just lose the ability to access that part of the body. So it's super important to be able to take your joints to their full range of motion so that you can own that. Another important principle with mobility training is that people tend to get injured in the positions they don't train, right? So if you are lunging or running and then you go and you step like this and then you rotate in and then you get a lot of pressure on this knee because you're internally rotating the hip, if you never train external rotation and internal rotation of that knee capsule and with the hip, then your body's like, whoa, like I've never been here. I'm not familiar with this space. So then that's when you can kind of get an injury. So basically mobility training is positional isometrics through rotation so that you can bring strength and nourishment to all those end range positions so that you can be strong everywhere and that your body can be as most prepared for whatever activity that you do. And especially if you're doing beam try, because in beam training, you can get into some pretty finicky positions, and it's super important that you've actually spent time in that space and building resiliency and strength within those end range positions so you can be strong. So we're going to dive a lot more into mobility training soon. All right, cheers.